Rise and shine, ladies and gentlemen, cock a dildo too. Today I'm here to talk about... If you've been on the internet at all within the past couple of months, then you've definitely heard of Invincible. People have created hundreds of memes following the think blank think format, and the show itself has been hyped up like crazy, with some even calling it one of the best superhero shows out there. Now, is that true? Is Invincible actually worth the hype? Yeah, it is. But it's not just an amazing superhero show, it's an amazing show period. One that has both an emotional heart and a gripping narrative, alongside some pretty interesting characters in the form of Mark, our main character, and his dad, Nolan, aka Omni-Man. Now, I am late to the party on this one, but regardless, I want to talk about this series because Invincible seriously impressed me. From an outside perspective, Invincible doesn't seem to be anything special. Its first episode showcases standard superhero shit while also introducing us to a kid named Mark, someone who recently acquired his latent powers and soon after entered the world of heroism. Now, let's be honest, that sounds pretty fucking basic. And with the simple art, lack of shading, and general presentation, nothing about Invincible at first glance screams exceptional. But here's the thing, this initial perception is purposely played into because that's what Invincible wants you to believe. It wants you to think that the show is standard and following convention, when in actuality, it's not. You see, the majority of superhero stories follow a simple structure. There are heroes and there are villains. Heroes do cool hero-like things to protect the world and or civilians from the bad, naughty villains. And villains do not so cool unhero-like things to that's hard. And villains do not so cool unhero-like things to fulfill their own desires. And this structure is exactly the same structure found within Invincible, or at least that's the impression you'll have as you watch its pilot episode. However, what the show does brilliantly is that through this first impression / purposeful misdirection, it deceives you into thinking that Invincible is a typical good versus evil story where in the end, the heroes will come out on top having saved countless. But by the time you reach the ending credits for episode 1, a shocking revelation is made and you realize very quickly that Invincible is anything but that. Yes, it has heroes, yes, it has villains, and yes, 80% of you guys are still down bad, but through subverting our expectations as to what the hero / villain dynamic entails, and by taking on a much more sinister, brutal, and unfiltered approach, Invincible is able to tell a story that's extremely interesting. A story that not only engages the viewer and entertains the entire way through, but one that also gets you to think and reflect over what being a superhero really means.
Try it a little more like this.
Like what?
This scene is one of my favorite highlights from early on in the series, because it has impact. For context, the scene shows a training session between Mark and his dad. Going into it, Mark acts under the assumption that everything will go smoothly. He thinks that all he has to do is to learn how to control his abilities, and naturally, he would then get stronger and do hero shit afterwards. But when he gets hit, Mark starts gasping for air. Breathing becomes difficult, and it's here when Mark realizes getting punched hurts. But being hurt is part of being a hero. And sometimes that means living a life of pain and suffering. To backtrack for a second, in most stories, heroism is often portrayed as something righteous and noble. And because of this, a lot of people look up to heroism and wish they could be heroes too. For example, when I was a dumbass kid I was, and kind of still am, I wanted to be just like Spider-Man because I thought being Spider-Man, being a hero, would be really fucking cool. But what I failed to realize back then was as cool as being a superhero would be, it would also really suck. How exactly? Well, in order to be a hero, you have to throw a punch with the intention of severely injuring the opposition. But more than that, you also have to be ready to be hit by said opposition, an opposition who may fully want to kill you. And Mark getting punched is a fraction of that reality. In battle, it's essentially a real life or death situation where he can actually die and where his actions can cause the deaths of real people, which is horrifying because both his life as well as innocent bystanders are at stake. And so Mark has to be ready to fight. He has to be ready to be hurt, to lose his life, and to see others lose theirs. The truth is, under real-world circumstances, a world of heroes and villains is one where death is looming on a day-to-day basis. And it's this concept that makes Invincible, but more importantly, Mark as a character so compelling. People can and will die, and no matter how hard Mark tries, sometimes he won't be strong enough. He won't be able to save those in need of saving, and it's through directly facing this harsh and cruel reality that Mark is able to grow and develop as a person. Initially, he starts off much like us, the audience, a naive, misguided kid brimming with idealistic optimism. But as he fights, as he grows, he becomes increasingly battle-hardened, matured, and also broken. Which is all the more felt as the show fully embraces the presence of death, and when it needs to be, is gore-filled, raw, and brutally honest in how it plays upon the idea of consequence. Things don't play out how they would in comic books, they play out like they would in reality. Every time Mark fucks up, and he fucks up a lot, there's no Deus Ex Machina to save his stanky ass. Instead, he suffers. He goes through heavy physical and mental trauma as a result of each and every single one of his failures. At times, he loses his drive and contemplates whether or not being a hero is worth it. A part of him wants to do what's right, but another part of him just wants to indulge in selfish desires. And that's something I can sympathize with, because those thoughts, those doubts, those moments of hesitation feel human. Now, I know I've talked about characters feeling human a couple times on this channel, but I always mention it because to me, when a character feels human, it means something. Because human characters are characters who are flawed, who make mistakes, and who sometimes are irrational. And because they're like this, I'm able to invest myself and relate to the characters being shown that much more. I feel a deeper connection. Mark's powers make him super, but superhero shows aren't interesting because of the super, but because of the hero. And that's the aspect that makes Mark so interesting. He's very similar to Peter Parker, as despite being super, he's unsure of himself. He doesn't really know how to be a proper hero, and is also constantly struggling between balancing his real life and his hero life. But even with such struggles, he tries. And in the final episode, when he's at his all-time lowest, when everything feels lost with his body left in pieces against unwinnable odds, he still stands his ground and fights. Despite everything, his mind, spirits, and humanity remain invincible. On the opposite end, there's Omni-Man, his dad. Omni-Man is probably the most interesting character in Invincible, right next to Mark. But before I talk about him, I want to quickly address some small criticisms I have with the show. First off, I thought the pacing at times was a little bit too fast. For example, Mark could get straight up bodied, murked, and end up lying right before death's door, then 20 minutes later, he'd come back good as new. Now personally, this wasn't really a big deal to me, nor did it hinder my enjoyment at all, but I can definitely see it affecting someone else's experience, so I thought it was worth mentioning. My second complaint is Amber. She was extremely bland as a character and didn't really bring much to the table, which made it difficult to actually get invested in her. But what's worse is later on in the show, she has a brain aneurysm and concocts one of the most stupidest arguments known to man with Mark. And it's actually this argument / mental retardation on Amber's part that made a lot of people hate her. Personally for me, I started viewing her in an even lesser light, but in the first place, I never really cared for her, nor did the show try to add any depth to her character, so take what you will from that. The animation sometimes is also very lacking. There's these shots that look just plain awkward and definitely take the viewer out of the moment, which is unfortunate because with just a little bit more polish, the show could have been both a visual and storytelling spectacle. But my guess is that was probably not possible due to budget issues. On the bright side though, the show's depiction of blood and gore are extremely explicit, and this allows for the serious / emotional scenes to hit all the more. Now back to Omni-Man. Over the course of the show, you'll find yourself continuously thinking back to who Omni-Man is and what his true motives are. And that's because his entire character is always shrouded in mystery. Questions and unknowns surround everything he does, but no matter how much you want answers, the show never gives you the full picture. And so you're left in the dark with your thoughts resting in the back end of your mind. The episodes keep on going and you keep on wondering, longing to know the truth. Now, for the sake of spoilers, I won't get into specifics, but Omni-Man is so damn interesting because of that mystery factor. On one hand, he's a loving parent, and on the other, He's a monster. He might be good, he might be evil, he might be somewhere in between. But you just don't know because he's kept as an enigma. Again, I know this is extremely vague, but watch the show and you'll know what I mean. Invincible is incredible. It's a show that plays upon expectations and showcases the brutal, gruesome, and realistic side of heroism through the lens of Mark, a character who feels and acts human. The mystery surrounding Omni-Man is also really interesting, and the show always keeps you engaged as it plays upon several plot threads that all intertwine for a huge climax in the finale. So give Invincible a shot, it might impress you like it impressed me. And while you're at it, subscribe.